Thank you all for having me here remotely. I'd say it's nice to be in New Haven, but I'm dialing in from Washington, D.C. I'd like to spend a little over 20 minutes talking about how information moves in Chinese cyberspace from the perspective of somebody who focuses on this for a living from a journalistic standpoint, trying to mine Chinese social media in order to gauge internal sentiment in the country. So a bit about me. I'm a senior editor at Foreign Policy Magazine. In late 2011, I founded a website called Tea Leaf Nation, which focuses on Chinese social media and uses that as a window into the country. We were acquired in September 2013 by the parent company of Foreign Policy Magazine. And I was then installed as a senior editor at FP and continue to do the same type of work. So I'd like to give an extraordinarily skeletal overview of Chinese social media. And first, let me start with an important caveat. A lot of major social networks that are available elsewhere, in particular Facebook and Twitter, are not available in China. It's the so-called Great Firewall of censorship. Some of you may have heard of it. Essentially, it requires special technology, so-called VPN, or virtual private network, to jump over. And while a relatively small and devoted group of Chinese internet users do employ VPNs to jump over the Great Firewall, the vast majority of Chinese web users or netizens don't have access or don't take the trouble to gain access to major foreign social media sites like Facebook and Twitter. And so instead, we've got this domestic ecosystem. So here are the two major platforms. The first is WeChat, also called Weixin in China. This platform is mobile only, and it consists of, in many ways, private conversations among friends. Now, certainly, these conversations are available and visible to Chinese government authorities. But the conversation that you have with your friends is not going to be picked up by a foreign journalist, and it's not going to go national unless you were to hop onto another platform. WeChat isn't just a mobile chat platform. It allows you to do pretty much anything these days. Not too long ago, a CNN reporter spent some time in China without their wallet and was able to do everything they needed to do using WeChat. So you can make a doctor's appointment, hail a taxi, send money. But it is also a platform for communication. It has around 550 million monthly active users, which is quite amazing. And it was released in January 2011. But its heyday didn't start until probably 2013. And significantly, WeChat is owned by and operated by a private company, Tencent. Now, the other big gorilla in the Chinese social media space is Weibo. And I would guess that some of you have heard of Weibo if you're China watchers. Weibo is usable via desktop or mobile. It's a one-to-many platform for self-expression and social interaction. And this is actually from the filings of the company that owns and controls Weibo, Sina. These are their words. Weibo has about 175 million monthly active users, so still more than 10% of everyone in the People's Republic of China. Still impressive, but obviously not approaching WeChat's numbers. And Weibo was released August 2009 and really had its heyday in 2010, 11, and 12. And Weibo is a one-to-many platform, like Twitter, which means that the conversations that you're having, unless it's sort of via private message, can be shared with and seen by anybody else. So if somebody important or famous, in particular a so-called big V, which is to say a Weibo user that is important enough to be verified, public opinion leader, picks up your post on Weibo, that post can then be shared with millions of people in an instant. Of course, there are other major social media platforms in China with tens of millions of users each. Some of them include Douban, which is a film and book review site, Zhihu, which is like Quora, if you use that, discussions among experts. Baidu Tieba, Renren is like a Facebook clone. There's many more, but I'm really going to focus on WeChat and Weibo for this talk. So I'd like to introduce you very briefly to some of the characters that inhabit this space. I'll first introduce you to the Wumao. The term Wumao means 50 cents. You may have heard of the 50-cent party. And 50 cents or half of a Chinese renminbi is allegedly what hired pro-government posters are paid per pro-government post. And it's used more generally to refer to somebody who reflexively takes the government position. Now, a description that I pulled of Wumao from Baidu Tieba, which itself is a social media site, is that the Wumao are, quote, fiercely ignorant, insert themselves in everything, and consider themselves spokesmen for the country. Now, Wumao number arguably in the tens or low hundreds of thousands, to the extent that they're paid pro-government posters. But there are a lot of people online who actually believe in the government position on many things. And they can be derogatorily referred to in some cases as Wumao. Now, looking up this, of course, is not my own illustration. This is an internet grab. And the description of Wumao that is available online says that their tactics include appeals to nationalism and communal piety, and certainly ad hominem attacks against those who hold differing opinions. Now, the reason I'm introducing this character, and one other that I'll show you shortly, is that the Chinese web, the social web, is a contested space. So if you go online right now in China and check out major social media platforms, what you're likely to see is celebrities, consumer lust, cats, and this is all normal for internets around the world. But what I want to emphasize, and what I've seen in my work over the last several years focusing on this stuff, is that the Chinese social media apparatus is also a complex one, sometimes disobedient to government diktat and fiercely contested, particularly as you've got sort of leftist, meaning conservative, neo-Confucian ideologies dueling with rightist or reformist ideologies. And these fights tend to play out online, even though the conservatives right now are definitely winning. So here's another character I'd like to introduce you to. Again, I must emphasize, this is not my illustration. This is a fair use pool, again, from the Chinese internet. This is the so-called public intellectual, or in Chinese, gongzhi. And this is also used as a derogatory term. So, obviously, as you see here, this negative depiction of gongzhi seeks to westernize their viewpoints. And some of the text you see on the left says, everyone knows he only cries for American imperialists. What are the deaths of innocents in Iran and Iraq? That has nothing to do with me. And the things that gongzhi or public intellectuals tend to call for are things like legal rights, taxpayer rights, constitutionalism. And these are concepts right now that are under attack and are being increasingly westernized within China. Now, while public intellectuals generally espouse minority viewpoints, they are a significant and influential minority in China, in many cases with elite education. Many folks who work in the media profession tend to view these same things as priorities. And the ideas that they espouse are, in some cases, common sense and are often widely recognized and understood, even by those Chinese who would not consider themselves a public intellectual. But it's also instructive to look at this image, of course, because, as you see, the mere association with the United States can sometimes be enough to get this accusation leveled at you. And so these are two of the major players right now on the Chinese internet who are sort of duking it out. So let me very quickly drop a footnote here on the censorship question. I described a few minutes ago the so-called Great Firewall of censorship, which keeps foreign companies, in some cases, out, allowing Chinese domestic social media firms to flourish. But you've also got censorship within China. And so something that you post on one of these native platforms, WeChat or Weibo, can certainly be censored. And that for some time was the Chinese government's chief tool in making sure that social media did not become such an independent force within the country that it endangered the control of the Communist Party. Now, the way that censorship works is extraordinarily subtle because there are very few clear written rules that tell you what you can and can't say online. To be sure, there are laws and regulations prohibiting rumors and harmful information, but what exactly does that mean? There's a 2013 legal interpretation that says that a so-called rumor read over 5,000 times or retweeted over 500 times can subject the author to criminal penalties. But again, how can you control that? Even if you're an everyday poster and you're not a so-called big V or an opinion leader, you don't know what you're going to write. You don't know how that's going to resonate online. You don't know if some other big V is going to pick that up and share it, making you instantly famous or infamous. And even as a big V, you don't know exactly necessarily what's a rumor or what's the truth when information is moving very fast in an event, in particular where facts have not yet become clear. So the way that Chinese censorship basically works is employing this very fuzzy red line between what's permitted and what isn't. And there's also a big focus, as I think you'll learn increasingly through this talk, on folks who have a big megaphone at their disposal. These big Vs who in some cases have followings that rival the total membership of the Communist Party in size. These individuals in particular have to be exceedingly careful about what they write. In terms of the amount of censorship online in China, it's certainly a minority, but a significant minority of posts. Some studies show about 12% of Weibo posts are censored, about 4% on WeChat, which makes sense because WeChat conversations, again, tend to be private. Now, one interesting thing is that for some time, and I'll get into this a bit later, the Chinese authorities almost exclusively relied on censorship as the way to keep stability in the Chinese web. But think about that for a moment. If you know that the steepest penalty for writing a post is going to be censorship, you may decide to try your hand anyway. Worst case, what you write gets deleted, you can write it again. If your account gets deleted, you can reincarnate yourself in another online account and write the same thing. That's a dynamic that's played out on Chinese social media for many years, but things are changing. So let me step back for a moment and get into a few case studies that show the power of the Chinese social web, and also how the Chinese authorities have used a combination of law and fear to bring online discussion to heel. So I think a very, very seminal moment in the development of Chinese social media and its power as a social force was the Wenzhou train crash. This is a relatively wealthy coastal city in China. And in July 2011, a high-speed rail crash killed over 40 people. It was a result of a defective signal box. And many have traced these defects, not only to runaway pressure to get a high-speed rail line running as soon as possible, but also to corruption within the rail ministry. Now, after this tragedy occurred, authorities in Wenzhou tried to bury the derailed train cars. But reporters and witnesses used their smartphones and their desktops to spread images of the Wenzhou train crash, primarily via Weibo. Government directives to restrict coverage were often ignored. And even those in the media who were prohibited from publishing on their own paper or website could simply hand these images off to someone else or publish anonymously on Weibo. And so, not surprisingly, these images spread like wildfire. And the Chinese government certainly attempted to delete these images. But once the proverbial cat is out of the proverbial bag on something like this, it's very hard to go in and scrub all images of a disaster like this from every corner of the internet. And so this again shows how toothless censorship taken alone could be. And I think this had a big effect on Chinese authorities. They realized that Chinese social media was not going to submit very easily to censorship, particularly given that the number of users vastly outnumbers censors. Let me take you to another case study showcasing the power of Chinese social media. This is a picture of Pan Shi, a real estate mogul. Now, in 2011, the United States Embassy in Beijing started sharing details about the concentrations of fine particulate matter in the air in Beijing. Now, the Chinese government had not been measuring so-called PM 2.5, this fine particulate matter, which was actually very harmful when inhaled. So the US Embassy took it upon itself to share its own readings on Twitter. Now, of course, Twitter is blocked in China, but as I explained earlier, some people with VPNs can choose to jump the so-called Great Firewall. And that's exactly what real estate mogul Pan Shi did. He started sharing the US Embassy's tweets on his Weibo feed. And within a couple years, Chinese environmental authorities, despite having initially dismissed Pan Shi, themselves started measuring and sharing PM 2.5 information. And the takeaway here is that despite the Great Firewall of censorship, because of social media, there's sort of this semi-permeable membrane between blocked foreign content and the Chinese web. Let me take you to another case study. And I'd like to introduce very briefly the concept of internet terror, which is basically terror among Chinese officials of having their careers ruined by angry internet hordes. And it really continues to be a factor. So let me tell you about the ruined career of this man, Yang Datsai. He's a former provincial safety chief. Chinese web users spotted him in summer 2012, smiling at the scene of a horrific accident. The left is a caricature of him saying cheese and smiling in front of a burning bus. It wasn't quite that awful, but the image of him smiling at this accident scene convinced internet users that Yang Datsai was a bad guy. And so they undertook what's called a human flesh search to suss out as much information as they could about him. And they quickly found that Yang Datsai had a propensity for wearing watches, the combined retail price of which surely exceeded the income of any honest Chinese bureaucrat. And once web users started collecting and sharing these images of him wearing a variety of expensive timepieces, his career did not last long. He was jailed in September 2013 for 14 years for corruption. And this is a cloud, this so-called internet terror, that continues to hang over a lot of government officials. They understand that it only takes a few folks with smartphones to capture them doing something untoward or corrupt. And it continues, I think, to have an effect on the behavior of Chinese officials in the way that they carry themselves in public. And the takeaway here is simply what many folks have learned the hard way in countries around the world. The internet is an archive and can be powerfully leveraged by crowds. And internet shame is also a very powerful force. Now, this is a backdrop of the power of Chinese social media to focus citizen sentiment. And up until around summer of 2013, about the time that Yang Datsai got his big conviction, Chinese social media really played three major roles. One is that it was a spleen belt. It was a way for people to go online and vent their spleen. And from the perspective of the Chinese government, that's not necessarily so bad. It's a lot better to have people, complaining than actually taking to the streets and protesting. It also provided a window into Chinese domestic sentiment. And this is very valuable for a lot of folks. It was valuable and is valuable for the Chinese government, who can look at what people are saying online, I think, whenever it wants. But it was also valuable for folks like me, foreign journalists who don't necessarily have the capacity to go interview 10,000 people on the streets, but can read what 10,000 different people might be thinking about the hot topic of the day online. And finally, it was sort of a community of people who in many cases shared similar values. That again may have changed a bit. In particular, it started to change in the summer of 2013. And that's really when a crackdown on Chinese cyberspace began, when things began to turn. In particular, these so-called big Vs on Weibo, but also people who were a force on places like WeChat, which also allows you to publish in a limited way to a broader audience using something called a public account. What the Chinese government started to do was go after the individuals who are really driving opinion on Chinese social media. The people with tens of millions of followers and millions of followers, many of whom espouse liberal ideas. The Chinese government realized that most people on social media tend to be lurkers. They're there to kind of take everyone else's temperature and see what's out there. If you can silence some of these loudest and chattiest voices, you can really have an effect on the atmosphere of Chinese social media. So the man pictured here is and was a big V. His name is Charles Xue, a venture capitalist, generally liberal politically. He was arrested in August 2013 for soliciting a prostitute, which he may well have done. But it was understood among folks in China that this was punishment for his outspokenness on Weibo. And he was actually paraded on China Central Television and declared his guilt prior to his trial, sort of besmirching him publicly forever. So the takeaway here was that around summer of 2013, the Chinese government started to implement a major insight, which is that online public opinion is powered by a small group of influential people. If you can strike fear in their hearts, you can help to control opinion. What does social media look like now? I described earlier, it tends to be calm and be on the surface. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is increased censorship, increased fear among those who would espouse criticisms of Chinese authorities and Chinese political decisions. But it also reflects the fact that the Chinese state media apparatus has gotten a lot better at creating shareable, peppy, social media friendly information. You might call it propaganda. Here's an example. In late 2013, Chinese President Xi Jinping famously went to a dumpling shop in Beijing and ordered his own dumplings. And this actually was an internet sensation. Above is an example of the kind of social media friendly information that Chinese state authorities produce. As you'll notice, only Xi Jinping's features are depicted with any detail. Everyone else is kind of generically rendered. Up top, somebody with a camera says, "Chairman," he says below, "Everyone sit. I am also here to eat." It's not necessarily funny, but it's a heck of a lot better than the press release style propaganda that had been coming out from Chinese media before. And so effectively what's happened is the party has realized that censorship itself is insufficient. The void that censorship creates in public discourse has to be filled by something. And so the party has flooded the digital space with its own messages. What I want to emphasize as an important caveat is that Chinese social media continues to have a great deal of latent power. One example is pictured above from February 2015. This is a former China Central Television reporter, Chai Jing, and he released an Al Gore-style documentary, very much like An Inconvenient Truth, calling attention to major environmental problems in China, something that everyone already knows about, but rendered in a very powerful way. This short film was called Under the Dome, and it was released significantly with a bit of an assist from Chinese state media. The People's Daily tweeted about it on Weibo, and it became an overnight sensation, an overnight topic of water cooler conversation within China. Over 100 million people viewed the video on streaming sites. And shortly thereafter, within days, the Chinese government did an about-face and censored this, even though it appeared when it initially was posted that it had state approval. So the fact is that the Chinese government, like the rest of us, never really knows for sure what's going to be hugely viral or hugely popular on social media. And so this is an X factor. And because it's an unknown, I think it freaks out party planners who don't know how to plan around it. So the takeaway here, I think, remembering that this video became viral years after the crackdown started. The takeaway here is that social media is still a very powerful latent force in China. It can knit the country together in common discussion. And significantly, it can show people with perhaps minority opinions, perhaps people with criticisms of the government, that they're not alone. Even if they're not the ones out there writing about what they believe, even if they're not the ones out there complaining, they can go on social media sometimes, and when there are these crystallizing moments, they can see that they're not alone with their complaint. The social media landscape that China inhabits now is one, again, calm and ruddy on the surface, but it's also one where the Chinese government must constantly work to channel public opinion. And I'll just very briefly flick at this issue here. This is another case study. In June 2015, a cruise ship on the Yangtze capsized, killing around 400 passengers, many of whom were seniors. And this was a huge topic online. People began to ask, why were weather signals about an incoming typhoon not speedily heeded? How is it that the captain escaped with his life? Who owns this company that owned the Oriental Star and who was regulating it? All very good and sort of standard questions that you would expect people to ask. But these voices very quickly receded. And ruling authorities not only made clear to the families of the victims that they should not go on social media and share their stories, which they didn't. They cordoned off the area near the accident, were very careful about who they admitted so that you wouldn't have any of these Wenzhou train crash style images, really heartrending images, spreading in Chinese social media. And finally, they filled the void with their own information. So as a Western journalist covering this issue and covering it from a social media angle, it wasn't hard for me to see all sorts of discussion about this issue, but it was all speaking with the same voice. It was coming from a small number of press release style reports. And it played up, of course, the very real heroism of the divers and the government rescuers who were in there trying their best, I'm sure, to save those who could still be saved. But that was the emphasis, and discussion about the larger social issues or larger governance issues that may have allowed this, this disaster to occur was muted. So let's just take a step back. What about the web scares the ruling party? There's a few things. We've learned that news and information can leak before it is vetted and then spread wildly. We learned that from the Wenzhou crash. Online anti-government anger is real and can ruin careers. That's Yang Datsai, that case study among many, tells us of the power of internet terror. Big V's, big social media opinion makers can publish instantly to huge groups of followers that in some cases exceed the size of the Communist Party. And finally, the web can cohere and focus public opinion. For example, PM 2.5 becoming a hot conversation topic and putting pressure on government authorities. Under the Dome, surprising even state media minders with its popularity. And the web can signal to those with minority opinion that they're not alone. But it's important to emphasize that reporters, bloggers, and those who manage social media platforms are susceptible, like anyone else, to intimidation. And Xi Jinping's anti-corruption crackdown, which you may have learned about, in combination with internet terror, have made local officials much smarter about these things and far more unlikely to flaunt ill-gotten gains. And so you're less likely to see the kind of viral discussions you saw around Yang Datsai. And finally, while the followings for a given internet opinion maker may be huge, the ties among their followers are attenuated, while the government has a monopoly on force and violence and can bring that power to heel, to arrest and intimidate people. Nonetheless, the internet remains a silent battleground. The government's so-called, victory, I suppose is one word, is by no means complete, and they know this. Pictured here is Lu Wei, a Chinese internet czar. I think he and other officials in the propaganda and information departments understand that keeping Chinese social media at bay as a social force requires constant effort. They need to channel and divert public opinion, but they cannot dam it completely as with water, because that dam might burst. Lu Wei has a vision of the internet, I think, where he has said, quote, differences are shelved. He wants the internet to be an engine of commerce and innovation, but also one where nobody says anything too provocative. And I think there's a legitimate question about how many of the things about the social web that scares the Communist Party are in fact inherent to its structure and cannot be suppressed or wiped away ultimately with any amount of regulation and suppression. And so therefore, the so-called threat of Chinese social media as a social force will remain. I think that's it. I don't want to take too much of your time. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to field any questions in the time we've got remaining.
All right, thank you so much, David. And with that, we'll go into the question and answer session. Kian, I think you had a question. You're welcome to come up here or read from your seat.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Kian O'Dowd. I'm a Yale MEM candidate and Renmin University of China MBA candidate. So we've been collecting questions from all across the GNAM. Looking forward to this event. So we're just going to kick off with one, and then we'll open up to the class for a more broader discussion. So our first question comes from Beijing. So it's for David. So David, from your long experience covering China, what are your thoughts on the recent cases of detention of foreign journalists or refusal to grant visas? What do you think are the motivations behind these actions? And do you think that they're temporary or a troubling trend?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that the Chinese government views discussion of China as its purview to regulate and its purview to control. And I think my sense from everything I've read is that from the perspective of Chinese authorities, it doesn't matter very much whether what's being discussed is being said in Sweden or the United States or Germany or Japan. If it touches on, what they see as sort of the dignity of the People's Republic, then it's something that they have a right to control. Now, whether they can control it or not is another question. But I think you're seeing, not just in China, by the way, but in many places around the world. Turkey is a great recent example. You've got authoritarian regimes that believe that they should, and in some cases can, control speech about them wherever it may be. And I think, ironically, part of that somewhat Orwellian turn can be traced to the modern nature of media itself. Time was what somebody said in a video that they made in the United States was never going to find its way into China, and certainly not into the computers of millions of people. But now, as I described earlier, there's a sort of semi-permeable membrane between different media spheres. Pan Shiyi, the real estate mogul, who started tweeting about PM 2.5, he did that because he saw something on Twitter, which he then brought back over into Chinese media. And so I think authorities have actually gotten more vigilant and more jumpy, because they understand that if something resonates, it's going to spread, even if that discussion is nominally happening elsewhere, or is happening on a social media platform whose servers may not be in Beijing. Okay. Thanks for that question.
Perfect. Thank you, David. So what we're going to do now is just open it up to the class. So if anybody has any questions on your mind, anything you want to ask David, yeah, sure. Please, if you could just use your mic when you ask the question so that David can hear you.
So according to my observation, our generation, can you?
Yeah, just speak up a little bit. Thanks.
Speak a little
Sure.
louder.
So according to my observation, my generation of young Chinese people are spending more and more time in social media just to entertain themselves. For example, stalking celebrities, following on their divorce or their weddings, instead of spending time on reading books, acquiring knowledge, or develop their own critical, independent thinking. So we know that in this kind of scenario, the unwisdom of crowds can be easily manipulated by the other individuals or parties that can be driven to some instability in Chinese environments. So I'm wondering what kind of role the social media can play in helping people improve this kind of situation. And what's your observation around this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And luckily, I get to be in the position of observer and critic, rather than being the one who actually has to, make decisions about how social media should actually be regulated. So I'm aware that I have, in some ways, a privileged position, and it's much harder to be the one in charge making these choices. I think you could probably tell what position I take. As a trained lawyer in the United States before I entered media, I've got a particular view about how free speech should work. But it's obviously one that the Chinese government doesn't share. And I think one thing I would say is that you're absolutely right from everything I've heard and observed. Whether it's in China or elsewhere, people are spending more and more time online, and that's becoming more and more integral to their lives. And also, a lot of the time that they spend is not necessarily doing productive or enriching work. I mean, we want to be normative about it. And that's not the Chinese government's fault. But I do think that there's a desire, at least among a vocal minority, to have discussions that go beyond the everyday and the quotidian into something that is a little more political. And again, this isn't just an invention, of mine. If you look again at Under the Dome, for example, and how popular that was, even if it was sort of like lightning and then it disappeared. There is that desire. And I think that's where the Chinese government is drawing a line and saying that we can't accept that. Now, I would note that, there is a real issue of social trust on the Chinese web. And I think there's actually a lot of support domestically for crackdown on fraud and rumors. I think the question is just, is the Chinese government taking the most narrowly tailored measure in order to go after rumors and fraud? Or in fact, is their definition of rumors somewhat self-serving? And are they really using that, doing some of that, but also using that as a cover to go after speech that isn't necessarily rumor mongering, but they view as threatening? But yeah, thank you for pointing that out. There's no question that, many people are much more interested in sharing pictures of their cats than in discussing, the best governance structure for China. And that would be true anywhere.
Yeah, I think that's true with every country, not just China. Great, thank you so much, David. So any more questions from the, yes, thank you.
Hey, can you hear me? So
Yes.
My question here is, do you think social media can help China to incubate democracy internally? Because it looks to me that government is more open and embrace more on social media. And we know that we have Wumao and also we have 50 Cent. So basically people openly debate on public issues. Even the social media represent different government entities debate the same issues. So do you think actually social media can play this role about internal democracy within China? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it's clear that Chinese social media is still the closest thing that China has, or probably has ever had, to a platform for free speech and free debate about the issues of the day. Again, we're speaking relatively. So even in its diminished state, I think it plays that role. And what's interesting, and I'm sure some of you, in this classroom already know this, the Chinese government understands that fact. Since the late 1980s, they have espoused this concept of, I think it's yulun jiandu, public supervision via public opinion, by the public sphere. I think the Chinese government does understand that public opinion can be valuable as a check on the worst abuses, and also can bring to their attention information that they might not otherwise see. And I think that's one reason why the Chinese government has had this conflicted attitude towards social media. Xi Jinping called recently for well-intentioned criticism. He said, well, we do want criticism, we just don't want it from those kind of, America-loving govt. So I think the Chinese government gets it. And that's one reason why, even when Weibo was, a really major independent social force, I don't think they ever thought about pulling the plug on it. because they can get so much valuable data just from looking at what people say. And there's no question they do that. They employ people to do that, both on Weibo and on WeChat. And I think you're right that it's sort of a simulacrum of democracy, but again, nothing close to the real thing. I think it does, how can I say this? I think it's useful. I think as the gentleman previous to you pointed out, it also, the internet can also be a place for lies and rumors and shaming. It's not always a productive public sphere. But then again, what public sphere is? I think the provocative part of your question that I can't answer is where does the Chinese government go from here, right? Can they continue to kind of use social media and sort of staple it onto the side of the party superstructure in a way that's actually productive? My guess would be that they're still figuring it out. And they'd probably rather err on the side of being conservative and losing some valuable information than on erring on the side of being liberal, getting a lot of good feedback, but also risking creating this entire independent entity at the top of them.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, David. So we've got a question from our Senior Associate Dean at Yale School of Management, Professor David Bach. Unfortunately, Professor, he couldn't make today because he's lecturing in South Korea, but he sent us a question. So his question is, there are two broad views of the political effects of social media: democratization of information and empowerment or segregation. So with the implication of a growing ability of opinion leaders, they try to manipulate and mobilize group members against other groups. So what do you feel best describes the political effects of social media in China?
Well, I guess I can't choose both. Because I think it is, I basically agree with what I take to be the premise of Professor Bach's question, which is that really Chinese social media can have both effects simultaneously. I mean, I think it is a very valuable feedback mechanism for the government. It's a place where important national conversations, sometimes painful national conversations, can be had. And it's really the only way that those will happen right now. But I also do agree that, it is certainly inadequate as a substitute for more robust feedback mechanisms. It is a place, first of all, I think as the professor implied, highly unequal. You've got a very small number of opinion makers with huge numbers of followers, and then you've got, everyday, DLC like me who don't really have any followers on Weibo, and nobody really cares what we say unless it's retweeted by someone famous. And so the Gini coefficient in Chinese public opinion is very high. So there's no substitute, of course, for a structure that actually assigns votes to people and allows one person to have one vote. But I guess the provocative question, again, and I can't answer it, is just, is the Chinese government going to use social media to move in a slightly more democratic direction? Now that Xi Jinping has made 100% clear who's in charge, is he going to start to loosen things up a little bit in order to let some of the healthy promise of social media reemerge?
Okay, great. Thank you, David. More questions from anyone in the group? No? Yeah, sure.
Hi, David. Thanks for being here today at Yale SOM. My question is about business on social media in China. And we were talking a lot about kind of, political effects and motivations on social media. But can you describe how Chinese business is using social media today?
Yeah, I'm not sure how intelligently I can speak to that question. And I'm aware that I'm speaking to a business school audience. But I do just want to caution that I might not be the guy to ask. I come at it from a very particular perspective as somebody who reports on the country and uses social media as a window into citizen sentiment. So I don't think that I have, particular things I've noticed that you would find interesting, to be honest. Mostly what I know about business comes from my time as a corporate lawyer in China and then having built my own little business. But when it comes to sort of using social media to build your brand, I would probably defer to more expert folks than me.
Okay, perfect, David. Thank you. Any more questions from the group here in New Haven? Okay, great. So I have a question from a student that was submitted before the panel. So the question is, does the Chinese government ever intend to ease its tight control of social media? Do they understand how incredibly difficult it will become to restrict access as time goes by with additional applications and other channels using social media?
Well, I think that recent evidence actually suggests that they have had a great deal of success in bringing social media to heel. And I would not assume that with the proliferation of new apps, new platforms, new technologies, that the Chinese government is necessarily going to lose that battle. I can say right now that having started observing Chinese social media a little over 4 years ago, and having seen the amount of breaking news and major political conversations that were happening there then, I never would have imagined that it would be as, how can I put this? That it would have been neutered so much as a political force in the space of 4 years. The Chinese government, really has, I think, understood where the choke points are in social media, and they've grabbed them with gusto. And at the end of the day, as I've said, the Chinese government within China has a monopoly on force. It is the government. And that's something that no opinion maker can possibly match, at least in the short term. So here's what I'd say. I continue to have a great deal of hope in the Chinese people, and also in social media as an important force and a potential check on the worst abuses in the government. But I don't think that any of this is inevitable. I think it's not so much the profusion of new technologies which is going to force change, because we thought that was going to happen for many, many years. We thought it was inevitable that increased economic freedom, increased connectivity was going to democratize or at least open the country. We haven't seen that. So I'd say it's not inevitable, and it's going to require the courage of particular individuals or particular organizations who will emerge in places that we might not expect. But again, that's like anywhere else. So I hate to be, I wish I could be more sanguine, but recent evidence suggests none of this is inevitable.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Yes, please.
So the question about Alibaba and Tencent, and has China ever seen companies as powerful and as strong as they are? And how much leverage do they have in negotiations with the government and I guess the people at the top, Jack Ma and Pony Ma? How influential and immune are they to some of the tactics that the government has used in the past to kind of control large companies?
Yeah, that's a great question. And all I know is what I've observed, sort of reading the tea leaves from the outside, of course. You're absolutely right that these are incredibly powerful companies. These are sort of superpowers in their own right. And that's true globally too, companies that are as powerful as governments. I don't know that any of them, though, can currently match the Chinese government's power. One thing that's definitely worth noting is, again, WeChat and Weibo are operated by private companies. These private companies, as I think you're implying properly, are hopelessly conflicted because they want to respond to Chinese government diktat enough that they're not shut down, that they have good opportunities. But they also want to be vibrant places where users want to go. And this is obviously a conflict of interest. Right now, the ascendant platform or the dominant platform, WeChat, I think is run by a company that sees what they do as enabling frictionless commerce, versus Sina, which I believe, from what little I know, is more interested in Weibo as an expressive platform. Can they push back at the Chinese government? I'm sure they can, but generally we have seen the leaders of these major tech companies pledging fealty to Chinese President Xi Jinping's vision. After the internet conference in Wuzhen, for example, I think they've all expressed a willingness to abide by the party line, which suggests to me that they know very well that, very quickly, the government can, for example, find someone else to run the company or force a sale. from one founder to somebody else who's more government friendly. And we've seen these tactics used with success elsewhere, like Russia. It hasn't been necessary in China. But if it were, I believe the government would pull the trigger. And I think the business leaders know that.
Okay, fantastic. Any last question from the panel? Yes, please. Thank you.
Hi, David. Thanks for having you here. So probably you have already know the Puppy Jiang case in China. So it's like so-called the most expensive advertisement on social media. It's a 22 million renminbi. So based on your knowledge and whatever you know, if you are the advisor or if you for the company, Liren, right? So if you were the business owner, how do you take advantage of this platform or social media to create value for your business? Thank you very much.
Sure. Well,
yeah. So just the question basically is how the business creates value through the social media.
yeah. Well, I mean, Poppy Jiang is a really interesting case because my understanding is that she was backed. So for those who don't know, I think her Chinese name is Jiang Yilei, and she's a young, I think sort of a recent graduate, a recent college graduate who has a talent, obviously, for social media and received venture funding. And basically, they were funding her as a person, although I'm sure there's a corporate entity in which the money was going. But it's a really interesting case in the creation of value and also the destruction of value because of the sudden censorship, that she was subjected to. So, I mean, to me, what she tells me about the creation of value in Chinese cyberspace is that it's incredibly fragile and that it often depends on having the government's favor. And I don't know what happened in the background, who failed to check the right boxes, to talk with the right officials. But, that's the fragility of building anything around an individual brand. If that individual is taken off the airwaves or something happens to them that's scandalous or what have you, then the value disappears. And so maybe it's a safer move to create platforms that, aggregate large numbers of users where, the control happens at a different choke point rather than investing everything in one person. Because if you look at the Chinese government crackdown on big Vs, that seemed to me to send a signal, which is we highly disfavor famous individuals online. So Poppy Jiang, although she didn't really ever get anything too political, was still in that mold. And I think the government just said, that's not acceptable.
Okay, great. Fantastic question. So thank you so much, David, for your time.